So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's stupid. It's an abomination.
So there is still hope for humanity then?
Well, let's not go that far. My death is my oldest friend. You know, we were born together. What's wrong with these editors? Don't they see how wonderful these poems are? Love me, love me, love me, admire me, admire me. I steal from so many places at once that it's hard to keep track of everything I'm stealing. I'll teach you the secret handshake and it's all good. Has anything funny ever happened to me? The best magazines in the country describe me as an ape with my knuckles dragging on the ground. What could be more tedious than that?
Donald Revell, a luminary in contemporary poetry, is known for his evocative language and profound insights into the human experience. With a body of work spanning decades, Revell's poetry transcends conventional boundaries, inviting readers to explore the intersections of language, emotion, and imagination. Throughout his prolific career, Revell has spent more than a dozen books of poetry, translations, and essays. From his early National Poetry Series winning collection From Abandoned Cities to his recent masterpieces like The English Boat and Draw Adapted Wine, Revell's poetry embodies a profound yearning for transparency and innocence. Steeped in the traditions of Henry David Thoreau and William Carlos Williams, Revell's verse resonates with a sincerity that transcends literary boundaries. As he once remarked, craft is nothing, sincerity is everything. How accurate is that? And what is missing from this introduction?
I guess other than that it's more than 24 books, but I keep writing them until I get it right. But no, that sounds lovely. That sounds lovely. The Bronx became, in the 1960s, a kind of national icon for urban decay, which hurt me because to me it was a kind of Eden. First of all, it was my first place. Everybody was there. I was, the first years of my life, we lived in a 3-room apartment. My sister, myself, and my grandmother had the bedroom. My parents slept on a sofa bed in the living room, and we had a kitchen. It was a 6-story apartment building with no elevator. And everyone was there. We had African American families, Irish families, Jewish families. So I never really understood what all the fracas was about in terms of tensions. So I saw the Bronx as a kind of ideal place where everyone got along fine. Everyone was pretty much, it was poor, but you don't know you're poor if everyone around you is poor. We were all in the same circumstance. And it seemed wealthy. We had each other, we had enough to eat, we had friends. I went to public schools my whole life. So it was, part of coming of age was coming to deal with the fact that what I thought of as idyllic, the rest of the country thought of as an abomination or as a disgrace that needed to be changed. And that created, I think, an originary tension in me between the world as experienced and the world as represented. You know, because you still talk about the Bronx. It's a kind of joke. You know, you don't want to go up there. You know, when I was older, it was very hard to get a cab that would take you up there because they were afraid that it was this war zone. And I guess there were times when that was so, that there was violence, there were gangs. I'd seen bodies in the street, you know, it's not like, you know, Dresden, but I mean, but that was all part of life, and it seemed to me beautiful. And it was only when I left the Bronx that I realized what it was to everybody else. And but I looked at it as a marvelous opportunity. I mean, almost all of my teachers in the public schools, all the way through high school, were were emigres. Most of them Jewish emigres. Some got out before, some were Holocaust survivors. But what a wonderful thing to be educated by those people. And so I wouldn't change a thing about my childhood or the people that were there, except when I had that sort of traumatic, that might be too strong a word, sense of the difference between everyone else and their opinion of the place and my experience of the place. Because, for example, the Bronx is the only place in New York City that has original growth forest, i.e. trees that have been there since before white people came. There are some beautiful parks in the Bronx. It's the only part of New York City that's on the mainland of North America. Do you know why it's called the Bronx?
No.
The whole place was originally a farm owned by Jonas Bronk, a Dutchman. And so when you went there, you were going to visit the Bronx.
Possessive form.
Yeah, the Mr. and Mrs. Bronk. So I was very proud of it, and proud of we would use the word diversity now, but I wasn't aware of that. I just was aware that people came in all kinds. Irish, Jewish, white, black, Puerto Rican kids. We all went to school together. There was no particular animosity or trouble.
Is this the place responsible for your understanding of the sanctity of sauntering?
Yeah. I mean, so I don't say that I'm from, if people, in my personal life, and when I'm talking to my intimates, I don't say I'm from New York. I say I'm from the Bronx, because that's very different. The Bronx is not Manhattan. When I went to high school at the Bronx High School of Science, it was the first time I met people from all over the city, because you had to take an exam and get into Bronx Science, and people from all over the city would compete to get in. So that was the first time I met people from Manhattan, Brooklyn, et cetera, et cetera. And then the world was then vastated. Oh my God. I remember the first time I went to Brooklyn, I cried. I couldn't believe I was going to Brooklyn, because I'd only read about it in Thomas Wolfe. And it was just magical. This other world, which you literally could have seen from my porch. But I never want to write the same book twice. And so I sort of go from influence to influence, leaving other influences behind. Very few writers have been important to me the entire time. But some were very important for a while. But I guess the most durable writers for me have been Milton, Blake, and Ezra Pound. Those are the three that seem always to have been there one way or another. But they come in and they go out. Again, I hope I've never repeated myself, and not that I can claim to have reinvented myself, but I don't want to be just one poet. I want to be a different poet in every book, and to do what my teacher Robert Creeley said was the purpose of every poet, to take the whole trip. I want to be as many poets as I can be before I die, and in the hopes that one of them will actually get it right.
As many poets you can be? Well, that's oddly changes time and space within one person.
Oh yeah, I hope to change my mind with every poem. I mean, even when I used to teach poetry writing, and when I still teach it to myself, I like to imagine that every line is a change of mind. So that no poem is a tract, no poem espouses a point of view or something like that, but rather that with every next utterance, there has been a change of mind, so that the poem surprises me. It is not there to say what I have to say. It is there to lead me to what I find myself saying. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, no. Yes, it does make sense. But I think to immediately respond and say, yeah, it makes sense, would be very superficial, because it requires thinking. It requires maybe even a level of pure reasoning.
Well, you're thinking the whole time you're writing. You don't think and then write. I mean, poems don't have thesis statements. And the Bible doesn't say, make a joyful thesis statement to the Lord. It's just, it's make a joyful noise unto the Lord. And maybe the next line sounds like noise to me for a minute until I figure out, what was that just happened? It's unfamiliar territory, the next line, and sometimes even the next word. So that, you know, when I would teach poetry to young poets, mostly what I would do is I would go through their poem and cross out every word that was not the next word. And said, look at all these words that got in the way between the first and the second word. Look at all these words that got in the way between the first line and the second line. We just take those out, and then you have a poem. The title of this poem is A Hint to Lucretius, from my book, White Campion. The afterlife is an austere beast, fabulous, but austere. The most desired is charioteer to the broken alto of the least, hobbled by aftermath, but still beautiful, still with one bauble of scar upon her lip. Trouble my mouth with your mouth. Fill the rampant measures as Campion did. Tabard is you, and time is Terrace. My mother's name was Doris, a Greek unknown to her. Hidden among the wild herbs in their patterns are first things, and first things never die. To them the afterlife is a memory. When I was born, there were lanterns strung upon I-beams to the horizon. Nothing afterwards stretched so far. Upon the early mind, there are two loves, each a white campion.
Is poetry then an a priori thing or an a posteriori, like in terms of even the Kantian reconciliation of rationalism?
I would
and
think of it as an
criticism?
event.
As an event itself. So
Yes.
But even for the ability to perceive this event in the time and space, we need to have certain pre-existing level of intuition. So
Well, that might even get in the way.
That?
That might even get in the way of
gets in the way.
experiencing the event. Again, my teacher Robert Creeley would describe a poem as the activity of the evidence. So how can I know what's going on in a poem until it actually transpires, until it actually happens? And it hasn't happened until I read the whole poem. I mean, that's why people don't really like to read poetry very much, because they not only have to read it, they have to read it in the order in which it appears. So that you can't summarize it, you know, you can't make a précis of the poem. You actually have to read it in real time, from beginning to end. And that, of course, flummoxes the way so many people read, because they read to comprehend. But of course, you can't comprehend a poem. You can only read it. You know.
And then if order gets in the way, how does a poet perceive time in general? What is time to poetry?
Well, time is that medium into which the poem expands or expends itself. Okay, it's like the poem is immersed in time, eventually. You know, sort of like the way we know the universe is expanding, because the light is a red shift and not a blue shift. Into what is the universe expanding? I mean, if space is expanding, what is it expanding into? That can't be space, but it can't be nothing. So it's a terra incognita. And the poem is the same thing in terms of time. It's expanding into time. It's transpiring, but into what God only knows. But if the poet has a preconceived notion of where the poem is going, then of course it can't happen. Okay, it's old news.
But in your classes, sometimes you, first of all, you're known for a person who is sharing some insightful and fascinating idioms at the spot that apparently you also invent in your head at the spot. Mm-hmm. And one of them was that the past, the future, and the present are happening at the same time, especially in poetry. So what does that mean?
Well, all there is the present.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the present is where the past happens. It's also where the future happens. So we work in a very, very small space. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's sort of like what Goethe said, expire and expand. Mm-hmm. So we die into the poem in order to expand the poem. What Spencer meant when he talked at the end of The Fairy Queen about dilation. You know, the poem isn't there and then it is. And it's not a process. Mm-hmm. You know, we're not making widgets, you know, or microchips. It just expands into time and also the space of the page. But of course, in a poem, time and space are the same thing.
So does it make poetry a form of science?
Well, science means a way of knowing, right?
Isn't that what you were saying about
poetry?
Yeah,
well, the way a poet knows is by making a poem. Mm-hmm. So scientia and poesis turn out to be the same thing. You're making a poem, but mm-hmm. you don't know what you're doing until you do it. Mm-hmm. I mean, what's the point? I mean, that's the one thing that I feel sorry for some sort of poets who get stuck is they only write the poem they know how to write. And what could be more tedious than that? You're meant to write the poem.
Well, it is taxing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You know, you're meant to write the poem for which you are unprepared. And the education of a poet is a lifelong unpreparation. You know, to somehow hope to come to the poem unprepared. Mm-hmm. You know, and see if you have the ability, the courage, the pleasure to make the poem. Well, I think part of growing up was learning the difference between hostility and indifference. Indifference can be a great blessing. You know, I grew up where no one gave a damn about poetry, so that was a marvelous liberation. You know, it's a poem because I say it is. Mm-hmm. There's no one to tell me otherwise. And it's only when you go out into the great world that you experience hostility. You know, is poetry dead? Well, poetry is not dead, but it's on life support right now. Mm-hmm. And in a weird way, and this is going to sound potentially hypocritical, I think it's because of creative writing. I think the way creative writing has been institutionalized in American universities has to perforce be a kind of pyramid scheme, right? That for everyone like me who was making a living and feeding a family based on poetry, there has to be this enormous cohort of people who aspire to be me, not to write my poem, but to occupy that position. And there just isn't room at the top. There was for a while as MFA programs and creative writing programs proliferated, and so could accommodate poets as faculty members, but eventually we were credentialing many more people than could possibly have a career or a life in poetry in any professional sense. And I think that sort of watered down the credential in a sense. You have to start credentialing people that you really shouldn't, you know. And if you do that long enough, then the majority of the people who are talking about poetry don't know what they're talking about.
You're a modernist poet and you're a modernist scholar. What does it mean? Can you tell us more about your area of expertise? And
that would be a long answer. I hope you don't mind.
Like we can go as back as to Dante,
Oh, good. Okay, well then.
Chaucer. I know.
No, I can go further back than that. The first
Yeah,
modernist is Jesus.
Okay.
Okay, because when he taught people how to pray, people say the Our Father, the Pater Noster, all the time, but I don't think they very often think about what are you really asking for? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Mm-hmm. So every time we pray the Pater Noster, we're asking for the world to end. Because of course, when the kingdom of God comes on earth, that's all she wrote. Okay.
At the beginning of the 1,000-year
Yeah.
kingdom.
So I mean, I think that's what Nietzsche meant when he said that Jesus was the last Christian. Mm-hmm. Simply because there's nothing more to say. And there is that apocalyptic notion to the modernist. Now, probably Jesus wasn't the answer you wanted, so we'll fast forward.
Yeah, that's an answer that I find very fitting.
Well, I mean, in terms of perpetual disruption. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we fast forward, and you imagine what's going on end of the 19th, beginning of the Bergson and Nietzsche, coming to the realization, sometimes through eternal recurrence, but to the idea that all that's left for us to do is play. Okay, that the world has been imagined. Okay, originality as such has been exhausted. We've come to the limits of originality. I think probably originality ends somewhere in the Baroque. The Baroque is the furthest extent of originality. And after that, well, it's time to play now among the things that have been originated. That's what Bergson's talking about. Nietzsche is always talking about play, play, dance, dance. And so in modernism, you get this sense, when Rimbaud, who I think is the first modernist poet that we can give a name in terms of literary history. And what does Rimbaud say? Ce n'est que la fin du monde. It's only the end of the world. And end does not necessarily mean shut darkness void, but simply, okay, we're done with that now. We're not going to originate anything any longer, so let's play. When Apollinaire says at the beginning of Zone, at last you're tired of this elderly world, it's time to play. And that's why I think the modernists are all at play, homo ludens. Let's rearrange. I mean, even Eliot, who you may think of as a conservative modernist, says very clearly in 4 quartets, we're not going to do anything new. All we're going to do is repeat the words of people we cannot even hope to emulate. We're going to rearrange the furniture of literature and of culture. Cultures eventually die into a civilization, and a civilization is settled. It's very, like faith dies into a religion, right?
Culture dies into civilization.
Right. I mean, civilization is the end of a culture, because it says no more. Let's make up some rules now. Let's work out the courtesy, so we don't have to deal with anything new again. Same thing with religion and faith. Faith dies into a religion. Religion tries to civilize God.
And isn't religion then dies into a culture?
Well, no, because culture is Dionysian. Culture has no rules. It has no courtesy. It's a menace. Like Rimbaud. Rimbaud was the last poet of culture.
Yeah, but even Rimbaud, he goes back to his Gaelic roots, right?
But he calls it bad blood.
Bad blood. That's
Mauvais
true.
sang.
But there is a feeling of yearning for that bad blood.
Well, what he's yearning for is the catastrophe. I mean, après le déluge, right? When the rabbit is looking through the rainbow. He's looking forward to the end of humanity, to the end of the world.
To the slouching beast.
Right, to the apocalypse. And, thy kingdom come. It's been there a long time. But of course, civilization is always at odds with culture. because it distrusts the disorder of culture. If we go all the way back to the Our Father, yes, it's quite old, but I think in terms of dawning on the mind of and again, I'm only speaking of Western civilization because I don't speak any Asian languages, and so I don't have any authority to speak there. But in terms of the West, again, the last poet who did anything original was probably Milton. But we have to remember that William Blake was also Milton. Because as he said, Milton entered his body through his heel. So
very convenient.
Yeah, it works. So Blake and Milton are the same poet, and they're the last one. And modernism pretty much is at home with that, saying, okay, now it's time to play. Now it's time to rearrange the furniture. That's why modernist writing is so densely allusive. And I've been reading recent writing about my own work, and people seem very kindly to be catching on to the fact that my poetry is very allusive, more so than most of the people who read it ever get. And that's not because I'm so smart or anything. It's just because I steal from so many places at once that it's hard to keep track of everything I'm stealing, you know. But that's the nature of modernism, I think. And that's why, again, I love Rimbaud for saying "Ce n'est que la fin du monde." I love Apollinaire for beginning his greatest poem with "At last you're tired of this elderly world." So let's mess about. Let's allude until you finally get these modernist masterpieces that are nothing but allusion. I think we're already beginning to experience this, a contraction of creative writing programs, which again sounds very selfish. You know, well, it was great while I was making a living at it, but now it's time to close up shop. You know? But I think that happened, and a lot of people who talk about poetry really don't know what they're talking about. They don't even like it. I mean, I read a lot of new poetry, and it seems to be written by people who don't like poetry. That they don't want it to be what poetry wants to be. They want it to be something else, and then call it poetry. That's lamentable, but probably unavoidable, and certainly, at least in large part, my fault.
But is this lament also informed by the very idea that poetry and rhythm create meanings, and those meanings are being, as you said, watered down or just slowly disappearing?
Well, I mean, they're being hurried into meaning.
Hurried into meaning. Okay.
You know, so the poetry is supposed to have some practical application, which again it's a weird sort of version of socialist realism. I mean, there's a strange Stalinist whiff about a lot of contemporary writing. You know, that it's supposed to serve this purpose instead of serving its own purpose. And that's just not what art does. I mean, we saw that, you know, yes, the symphony for the tractors, you know, poor Shostakovich, what he had to go through, you know. And also, you know, recently, the film that got made against all the odds, you know, Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. I don't see how they allowed that to be filmed. It's a miracle.
I didn't see that one. Did you?
It's just out. It's just out. It's not in the United States yet, but I've been watching the trailers. Do you know the novel?
Yes, of
the
course.
Bulgakov?
Yeah. Manuscripts don't burn.
It's a magnificent book, a disturbing book, but magnificent. But there's a version of Soviet realism in contemporary American writing that's stifling and stifled and against the very nature of poetry.
Yeah, but Bulgakov was born in Kiev, and as a Ukrainian, I usually stand on the side that defends him and likes him very much.
Oh, I like him. I adore him.
Me too.
But reading that novel is a very disturbing experience. Which means it's a great book. I mean,
You mentioned that you have no authority in the other parts of the world,
Right.
like you don't speak Asian languages, therefore you should not be entering that territory. And
I am no critic of a culture that
Yeah.
to which I have no legitimate access.
And here's the question that I had, but are those ideas that we discussed before about time, poetry, space are essentially universal?
I suspect so. I mean, one of my earliest teachers was a specialist in Hindu literature, and he was a Thoreau scholar and was very interested in the way Thoreau began to read the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita and things like that. And so I can, in an unprofessional way and with no legitimate authority, see things that fascinate me, let's say in Hindu literature, and to a lesser extent in Buddhist literature, that seem to rhyme with thoughts I'm having. But again, I wouldn't want to trespass on that culture by pretending to an authority. It intrigues me. I do not feel when I read the Bhagavad Gita, I do not feel when I read the Upanishads that I'm in a hostile territory or in something that escapes me entirely. But again, I don't want to trespass where I'm clearly at best a tourist.
But if we try and suspect, I don't even want to assume, just suspect that there is something universal about this modern element. But there's also the term modernity.
Yeah, well, I would think so. I mean,
how does that work in this context?
Well, I mean, I think of one of my favorite modernist writers from India is a novelist called Raja Rao, R-A-O. And he has a magnificent book called The Cat in Shakespeare, which seems to be a beautiful notion of the sense of play. And you think of the way Nietzsche was fascinated by the Hindu deity Shiva, dancing in the ring of fire. You suspect that the truth may turn out to be true.
Zarathustra rings a lot of bells there.
Yeah. The truth may turn out to be true, and there may be such things as universals.
And then there is the same, what does Nietzsche call it? The intoxication with sublimity, the beauty?
Yeah. Well, again, we got to be careful when we use phrases like sublimity and beauty, simply because there's a lot of arguments.
That's Nietzsche.
Yeah, oh, I know, but we can get a lot of different people telling us that, no, that's not what the sublime is, this is what the sublime... And the sublime is really a phase. I think it's Schiller who talks about it, I think, most intelligently in his book on the aesthetic education of man, where the sublime is that beautiful moment when the human being as a creature of sensation coexists, albeit briefly, with the human being as a creature of idealities. So that in the sublime moment, sensation and ideality coexist. And that's wonderful. But beauty is more than that.
Isn't Kant's pure reason the sensibility that coexists with the pure reason, the thinking deprived of any other interference?
But Kant would not be all that attached to sensation.
Well, but he says but he says that the pure reason is interested in itself and directed by an inherent goal. And yet he sees there is a potential for a symbiotic relationship with the sensual world, because
Schiller and Kant are not at odds with one another.
Because reason is blind without senses.
Right. But in the sublime, sense and reason seem to coexist in a very transitory harmony, but in an unforgettable harmony, if that makes sense. And you know, the whole business of goals is very troubling because, of course, the goals of sensation can be barbarous, but so can the goals of ideality. You know, the ravenous tiger and the passionate ideologue can both destroy.
We are back to Blake again.
Yeah,
Tiger burning bright.
Exactly, exactly. Did he who make the lamb make thee?
Make thee, exactly.
Yes, you know, so
That's what I was thinking.
you know, so we have to somehow make room for the screaming baby and Joseph Stalin. they're both
That's
menacing.
scary. That's terrifying. Isn't
Oh
it?
well, reality is terrifying.
I heard people even die in it.
Yeah, it's an abattoir. You know, and I wish I had the intelligence to make sense of it. This is a fairly new poem called "The Measure." It is child's play. Creatures too perfectly disguised for the hawk's notice, even as the hawk screams. Retreating shadows, mother and child play at immortality. Age it forward. The hawk consents. Although he may well starve, he consents, dropping one feather in praise of the resistless intelligence of the moment and its realism. Our shadows are eternity's accurate measurement of time. They retreat, and so eternity takes shelter among the creatures, as a creature. Christmas on a given Wednesday, housed by feathers. What hope is the hawk? We live forever in the cool shade of his pain and noise. We are disguised by what he cannot eat. Beautiful measures denude his tree, and even he, perhaps he most of all, screams delight into catastrophe. Destitution is a small price to pay for life everlasting, in the sketch of light, outlining shadows. And by that I mean nothing more than the whisper of evidence, death. I mean the disguise of your mother and of mine. We were small, and we were taken to safety. A barbed arrow of sound pierced the air overhead, making a pause in creation. That was the beginning of beauty. Well, remember there's that wonderful chapter in Walden that begins, I awoke to an answered question. You know, or that marvelous line from Denise Levertov, you have come to the shore, there are no instructions.
Because it's already there and we just didn't know that it was?
Yeah, or we didn't know that it was, and we didn't know that it was.
Okay, elaborate.
Well, no, just you know, the astonishment of what is. I mean, because we are creatures who are basically ventriloquized by the language in our heads, something has to happen to wake us up out of that dream of the language that's, you know, ventriloquizing us, and to at last present us with something for which we have no words. And then we see it. I mean, because if you have a word for it, you never see it, you only recognize it. You only see it again. So one of the purposes of poetry is to make the world unrecognizable so that you can see it. So it's not about mystification, it's not about obscurity, it's not about cheap versions of surrealism marketed without the sanction of Breton. But
I can hear some poets screaming in agony right now.
good. There's only room for 3 or 4 in any generation, and the rest.
Okay, I'll take it. As long as I'm one of them.
Huh?
As long as I'm one of them.
Of course, you're in the club. Yes, I'll teach you the secret handshake, and it's all good. No, but I mean that in all earnestness. Mm-hmm. One of the most difficult circumstances of a languaged animal is that we live in a world that has been made recognizable, or which we insist upon being recognizable. And there you go. That's civilization, not culture. Mm-hmm. Culture is very happy with the unrecognizable. You know, the Bacchae, you know, the Dionysic rites. But art, the only art I can speak of with any validity is poetry, is there to wake us up from the dream of recognition and to astonish us with the unrecognizable fact of what is real.
Does it mean that poetry is neither external or internal to human mind?
Yeah, it's neither one.
It's neither one.
It's, like I said, the activity of the evidence. I mean, you to read a poem is, of course, to internalize it. Mm-hmm. But it's best to read a poem not expecting to comprehend it. The first thing you do with a poem is read it, not understand it. You know, it happens. It transpires, word by word, line by line. And then you see what happened as a result of what happened.
When I read an apparition in a metro station or a red wheelbarrow, I can see the poem. How do other people open their eyes to be able to see it? Can you explain the red wheelbarrow to us? Or is it something that should involve a very personal experience?
Well, the red wheelbarrow is a great poem if you read it. I mean, the genius of that poem is in the line breaks.
I thought in images, but okay.
No, there are no images in poems.
Say more. I love this. This is why I want to talk to you, because phrases like "there are no images in poetry." It's not just controversial. It's why?
Really the case. I mean, I look at a poem and I see words on a page. I see, you know, a piece of paper more or less covered with ink. Mm-hmm. Where's the image here? Now, if you make an image out of it, that must have been because you got good instructions. And what instructed you? The line breaks.
Okay, and that's what they...
So when you read the red wheelbarrow, the line breaks tell you how to put the wheelbarrow together in its place. And so if you were to print that poem out as prose, it would be stupid. Mm-hmm. You know, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's stupid. But the line breaks make it genius. It's very hard thing it's the hardest thing to teach young poets. Is the line break is your greatest resource. Mm-hmm. And it's what you must learn how to use.
Embrace the jumbant.
Yeah. And know when to, when not to. I mean, and that's the genius of it. But if you just say, well, it's the imagery. No, the image is trite. You know, it's from a bad calendar. You know. But the way it occurs on the page is genius.
What you just said about the Bacchic element kind of relates to what W.H. Auden said regarding the ideal reader. Mm-hmm. He said that every poet has his dream reader. Mine keeps a lookout for curious prosodic fauna like Bacchic and Coriambus to look you in the eye, even at 1 a.m. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean, and what is your dream reader?
Well, for me, it's a lot easier because my dream reader is the poem. I mean, I don't, and I've always sort of stumbled on when people ask me in public places about my audience. The only audience I'm aware of and the only audience I really care about is the poem itself. I mean, it's just, there it is saying, write me and do what I say, take me where I want to go. Where is that? You'll see. You know? And So I don't, I mean, I guess if I were really to say, who would you like to read your book, Donald? It would be someone who had read at least as much as I'd had and liked the same bits. You know, so there again, we're back to.
So you're looking for your counterpart,
right?
From a parallel universe.
Me, you know, me and my poem, and that's who I feel an obligation. I don't feel obliged to a readership, because it doesn't exist. There is no readership for poetry.
Somehow, semantically, it feels a bit selfish and egocentric, but in a transcendent way, it feels like this is the only way to approach poetry.
Well, it's the only thing that would be any good for the poem. I mean, I don't write the poem I want to write because I don't want to write a poem. I want to write. So I never sit down at my desk with a plan or even with a subject. I start writing.
I'm a teenage cancer with a plan. I'm sorry. I'm a teenage cancer with a plan.
Right, which is, I don't want to be a teenage cancer. And then, of course, the poem begins to appear. And as it begins to appear, it clearly it's like when you have a child. You can't really prepare for parenthood because there's this child that wants this, not that, and wants this now, not then. So the only thing you can do is pay attention. And I try to pay attention to the poem that's beginning to appear on the page in front of me and to keep up with it as best I can. But I feel no obligation to a readership because I don't have one. If I was aware of it, it would spoil the poem and it would never get written. I mean, I had a time. Can I be autobiographical is that
Please,
permitted?
Finally, yes,
oh,
that's
okay.
actually very welcome.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you were warning me about egotism, so I didn't want to go straight into my autobiography.
No, actually, I was trying to make a point that it may appear as a self-centric approach because essentially what you're saying, all that matters is me and my poem. The world outside doesn't matter. But that is required for the poem to be there in the world. The poem is the world outside. Exactly. While I'm writing. So I was trying to clarify that.
And really, even Narcissus isn't in love with himself. He's in love with that beautiful boy in the water. So we have to cut Narcissus a break.
And it is probably the best painting by Salvador Dali.
That's not a very high standard, but I can't think of him as a genuine surrealist. I prefer Magritte. But anyway, to sort of illustrate my own experience of this, when I was 22 and 23, I had a sudden run of luck. My poems were being published in really classy magazines, which is kind of cool for a 22-year-old and a 23-year-old. And I fell into the trap of thinking that I had figured it out, that this is how you write a poem. And so I entered a wilderness that went on for about 5 years of writing paler and paler and paler imitations of myself. And to nobody's surprise but my own, no one would publish them. Because of course, what made those first poems of mine that had such a lovely and, intoxicating success was gone. Because I was writing another Donald Revell poem, as if there was such a thing. And I had to, it took 5 years and the intervention of a very dear friend and his suggesting to me a group of poets that I had never read that sort of broke me, broke my habits, broke my confidence, and once again set me forth to write the poems I was not prepared to write. So I learned a lot from those awful 5 years, because it was, that early success was very dangerous. And I was clearly not mature enough to understand it, or to really continue it yet. So I had to go through a very difficult period, the worst of my writing life. For 5 years I didn't write a decent poem. And that was very difficult. And, you know, of course I went through all the phases of what's wrong with these editors? Don't they see how wonderful these poems are? You know, America has clearly come to the end of the road. If you can't embrace this stuff, you're savages, et cetera, et cetera. But I finally realized that it was just like making a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy. Eventually the page is blank. And thank God for this dear friend and the poets he forced upon me. I woke up and said, you know, write the poem you're not ready to write. And then I was okay. The poetry readings are a very unpleasant experience more often than not. Mostly because you get the feeling that the poet is playing the audience, trying to tease them all towards the line which, once he reads it, they will go, ooh. And, you know, if that happens once or twice in the course of an hour, I think that's totally pardonable. We're all vain. We all want approval. And so every so often you want to just like push their buttons. But there are some poetry readings where the poet is just push, 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 push. Love me, love me, love me, admire me, self-dramatizing. And this was one of those occasions. And the only thing to do, because I was sitting in the middle of the room, I couldn't just leave, you know, unostentatiously, was to light a cigarette. And that seemed to bring things to a halt, which allowed me to leave the room, because with everyone else's approval. Oh yes, please leave. So I was able to get out.
What year was it?
Huh?
What year was it?
1996. Yeah, I think 6 or 7.
Is it true that you were not alone in this endeavor?
No, I had my
Partner in crime?
my own cadre of like-minded sociopaths. No, I mean, I have been to some great poetry readings. Poetry readings that are still with me, and I honor those poets and the way they brought their poems into the common space. I have a lot of poetry readings on video, on cassettes, and I treasure them. So again, a great poetry reading is a great thing. And there are certain poets who gave a lot of great poetry readings, and I was humbled and delighted to be in the audience on more than one occasion. But because of my professional life, I've had to attend poetry readings that were just awful. And it wasn't because the poetry was awful, but the presentation was so self-congratulatory and manipulative.
You translated poems by Arthur Rimbaud and Apollinaire, but I want to talk about Rimbaud just a little bit.
Sure.
He was 19.
When he gave it up.
Yeah.
That should terrify any poet. You know, are you as good as Rimbaud? No. And he quit when he was 19. Therefore, we may conclude, young man, it's very, very scarifying. But I think he was done. He had, I mean, if you read A Season in Hell, no one goes farther than that. You know, it began with the laughter of children, and there it will end. Exactly. You know, he came to the end of the world.
You translated this prose poem into English, therefore I would say it is safe to say that you're probably the best authority on the poem. Can you tell us more about it and why it mattered to you specifically?
Why Rimbaud mattered? Well, I loved the fact that he was an enfant terrible. You know, that intoxicated me when I was a teenager. I remember the first time I read Rimbaud, I was 16, and I had just bought the New Directions copy of A Season in Hell and went to a coffee shop in Manhattan. And I think I must have had 16 or 17 cups of coffee and just kept reading it. I was too young to drink, you know. So, you know, the only available. So I was just sitting there in Horn and Hard Arts, drinking coffee and reading A Season in Hell. And I said, my God, this boy has taken the whole trip. I mean, he can write magnificent verse, you know, like the verse of Au Cézanne au Château. That's gorgeous, you know, formal poetry. And then he can detonate it, you know, and just, but not lose intensity, not lose adventure, and get to the end and say, okay, I've done that. There's nothing more to do. And really, there is nothing more to do. That's what I meant when I was talking about modernism is not about originating anything, but rearranging the furniture. Where there's no aftermath to Rimbaud. There's only go thou and do likewise. You know. So even you skip ahead almost a century to Charles Olson, who's quoting Rimbaud all the time in his poetry. You know, the Kingfishers, if I have a taste for anything, it's only for stones, which is, you know, a direct quote from Rimbaud. Silence does not preclude catastrophe.
Okay.
You know, so the Kingfishers begins, what does not change is the will to change. So you can't postpone the Heraclitan universe by not talking about it. You know, and so it's just a question of will you keep pace with the catastrophe, or will you try to dwell in a silence that denies that it's even going on?
But isn't that what Rimbaud does?
No, I think Rimbaud tries to fast forward to the catastrophe.
Okay.
You know,
That makes sense.
Let's just do it. Let's get there. It's as if he understands what the Pater Noster is saying. Okay, if our real prayer is please God end the world now, because that's what every real Christian is looking forward to the most.
But it's also about our, and I'll show off in my old English, Hidei huam lichen chlaf, the everyday bread.
Oh yeah, well you have to, there's the most awful thing in the world is the meantime. And of course, if you think about that, what is our daily bread? It's the day. Give us this day our daily bread. So the day is your daily bread. It's your little portion until the real event, which is le fin du monde. You know, and Rimbaud said, why not now? And then when he stopped writing poems, he started selling guns.
That's a twist.
Well, no, it's not. It makes perfect sense. If what you want is the end of the world, start selling guns. You know,
yeah, I'll put a disclaimer.
Yeah, I'm not advocating that as a career path. Okay, I myself own no firearms, but you can see the and he was so at home with catastrophe. I don't think anything about the 20th century would have surprised Rimbaud. As a matter of fact, he would have looked at it as a bit, you know, behind the times. Been there,
right?
Saw that, you know. So that's why I think of Rimbaud as you know, the first last poet. Yes, it was also very wicked and silly, but I have had many more than one wicked and silly moment in my life.
Which is one of the faces of poetry.
Of course. I mean, every poet is part hoodlum. You know, because we're breaking the rules. Because again, we stand for culture versus civilization. You know, civilization is always trying to catch up with us and domesticate us. But the artist has to somehow avoid becoming civilized completely.
And keep the hair going.
Yeah. It's silly, but it's also fun. And young poets need to have their sense of fun. Sometimes you have to set an example of being a bad boy, just to remind them to be bad too, from time to time. You know?
That's Miltonic.
Oh yeah. I don't think Milton left anyone unoffended by the time he was done. There was no club that would have him as a member, and that was exactly the way he wanted it. Happily, I was not gifted with Rimbaud's genius, so I've been able to spread out my little portion over, you know, almost more than 4 decades now. But he just got there faster.
Could it be that he was wrong and that he should have kept writing?
No, no.
Why?
What else was there to do?
I don't know. That's because he didn't write.
No, I mean, I can't for the life of me think of, oh, if only he had lived to complete this next imaginary masterpiece. No, I think he just did it a lot faster than most of us.
We had a conversation with Dr. Hay about modernists too, and specifically discussed Jack London, and he expressed some sadness because Jack London died younger than most of the people, therefore he didn't happen as a modernist, and should have he lived, he would probably produce some work that we may see perceive as very important modernist work potentially, but alas, that didn't happen. Yet there is this feeling of unfinished business.
I don't believe in that.
What you don't believe in that?
No.
Why?
I mean, well, A, you don't get older than dead, so that's pretty simple. Plus, you know, speculation comes from speculum, which is a mirror. So when we speculate about somebody, what someone might have done, we're really talking to ourselves. You're not talking about what would Mozart have written beyond KV 626. You're talking to yourself. You know, I assume that
Right, because there's this unrealized potential, isn't it? That we.
I don't believe that potential is realized.
Okay, say more.
You know, if potential is real, it's already realized. And if it isn't real, what are you talking about? There's no next after the last. And everyone has their last. I mean, so I don't like this concept of there's potential and there's realization. They're the same thing.
If you follow the news, Alexei Navalny was killed in Russia.
God rest his soul.
And some people may feel that he would be a great example of this unrealized potential.
Well, no, he realized his potential completely.
Okay.
I mean, and he knew that. The man was many things, but he was not a fool. So he knew when he went back to Russia, he was a dead man.
Why did he do that?
That was he was realizing his potential. And now it's been realized. I mean, he might have chosen to live for his cause, but I think a part of him must have understood that dying for it was the most important thing he could do.
That's biblical, almost.
Not almost. No, so I would not call him a suicide, you know, at all, any more than I would call Christ a suicide. He may have been suicided, as Antonin Artaud would say, but that was the logical thing to do, the heroic thing to do. I don't pretend to understand it because I'm neither heroic nor particularly courageous. But I think when you look at what happened to that man, you either have to say he knew exactly what he was doing or he was a fool. I do not think he was a fool, if that seems honorable.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's not to judge the merits of his cause. The only thing that is to say is he believed it clearly, and he gave very vivid evidence of that belief. What more can anyone do? You know, I talk about poems as the activity of the evidence. Well, the most vivid evidence is that's pretty much it. You got it right. It's not unlike Rimbaud's abandoning poetry. That was the only next thing for him to do. I mean, what would be sadder than a geriatric Rimbaud? Rimbaud writing his memoirs, God help us. Some of you have already in your young lives lost a friend. and you felt the pain and the injustice of that loss and the confusion and the anger of that loss. And part of that suffering that you went through was also the suffering that you felt about yourself. Well, that could happen to me. Am I ready to die? Have I lived my life yet? And how can I go on living knowing that my life could end at any moment before it has borne fruit, before it's become the life I hope it to be? You hear that in the opening stanza of this poem. Yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more, ye myrtles brown with ivy, never sere I come to pluck your berries, harsh and crude, and with forced fingers rude shatter your leaves before the mellowing year. Bitter constraint and sad occasion dear compels me to disturb your season due, for Lycidas is dead, dead ere his prime, young Lycidas, and hath not left his peer. Who would not sing for Lycidas? He knew himself to sing and build the lofty rhyme. He must not float upon his watery bier unwept and welter to the parching wind, without the meed of some melodious tear. Somehow a given death has disturbed the order of the universe, seems wrong. One tends not to read elegies about people who lived to a ripe old age and died in their beds surrounded by their loved ones. An elegy is a poem that has anger at its heart and confusion at its heart, and doesn't want to be angry and doesn't want to be confused, but wants somehow, by writing a poem, to come all the way through grief and anger and outrage to something like peace and faith again in the natural order and in the goodness of the universe. A more recent elegy in our own history would be Walt Whitman's elegy for Abraham Lincoln, When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed. There is a case in point. A man, a leader, a good man, who died suddenly and too young under unjust circumstances. Whitman writes, When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed, and by the end of the poem, feels somehow restored to faith, to hope, and to trust in the world. I don't trust the powers of the universe to care for the good. I don't trust the powers of the universe to care for the gifted, to treasure what I treasure, to love what I love. It's very hard to live in a world where what you love is not loved. It's very hard to live in a world where what you care for is not cared for or treasured. And so Lycidas has a double existence, a double immortality. An immortality with Christ and the angels in heaven, but an immortality here with women and men on earth who are seeking to right the wrongs, to purge injustice, to prove that nature is true and that the world is a good place to live, a world that we can trust in and feel secure in and have faith in, not just today, but tomorrow as well. At last he rose and twitched his mantle, blew his blue shepherd's cloak. And then that word that we had lost all faith in, that word that seemed to have no meaning in the darkest passages of this poem, rings out triumphant and hopeful. Tomorrow, to fresh woods and pastures new. That last word, new. This is not a bad old world. This is a good new world. And that's the journey the pastoral elegy takes us on. It's really as simple as that. From feeling not at home in a bad old world to feeling entirely at home in a good new world.
How does one recognize a genius, either a genius poet or genius artist? Let's talk about art in general. Like, for example, if Mozart never existed and I write Turkish March today, will people see that as a genius work? If
It's really hard to say
if Donald Revell never existed.
if you take an artist out of his or her time, will they, does genius have a shelf life? Is it a historical or is it an ahistorical reality? I would opt for the ahistorical reality. That in a sense, all genius gets to the end of something. Talent, we were talking earlier about unrealized potential. Well, maybe a talented person can have unrealized potential. A genius has realized the entire potential.
So that's the difference between a talented person and a genius.
Yeah, I think a genius is absolutely realized.
It doesn't matter when the genius is
Dies.
gone or
No, that's that.
Yeah, potential is realized.
Even if let's have an imaginary genius who wrote one poem, but that you did it the first time, and I think that's the distinction. I don't. There's nothing missing. I wish that I wish that she had, or if only he had, if only she had. No, genius is complete.
Which Nobel Prize laureate in literature did not deserve the prize, and which
Most
one
of them
did, and which one did but was never awarded one?
Well, Pound, Yves Bonfoy, John Ashbery. The list is. The list is literally endless. And when you think of Pearl Buck got a Nobel Prize, but it's preposterous. But prizes are there to congratulate the people who give the prize and to serve the ends of the prize givers. And they're lovely things, especially if they actually benefit an artist and allow that artist to perhaps continue his or her work with some confidence and optimism. But I don't know anyone who could possibly accept a Nobel Prize without a deep sense of guilt for all the better writers who did not get it. And again, in most recent history, there are three glaring examples in the past decade: Yves Bonfoy, John Ashbery, and Geoffrey Hill, who, while they were alive, were the three greatest poets on the planet, without a doubt. And not one of them got a Nobel Prize.
Did Bob Dylan deserve one?
Yes, I hear he did. Bless his heart.
I know a story about you related to Bob Dylan in your childhood. Would you care to tell us?
I don't remember that story.
It's a story about your mother, Bob Dylan.
How I stumbled into poetry in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah, well,
the very first one.
The very first time I stumbled into poetry was, my parents were very simple people. They were intelligent, but they were not educated. Very good people. And one Christmas I asked my mother Bob Dylan had published a novel called Tarantula. And I told my mother I wanted Bob Dylan's novel for Christmas. Now, my mother, bless her heart, screwed her courage to the sticking place and went into Manhattan to Barnes & Noble, which at that time was the only Barnes & Noble on earth. It was on 5th Avenue and 19th Street. And she was very nervous because, there was this book she had to get. And she walked into I don't know if you were ever at the original Barnes & Noble on 5th Avenue, but it was marvelous. It was a kind of cathedral of books. And she went up to one of the salespersons and said, I need a book for my son for Christmas. He wants it. And he said, yes, ma'am, what book? Dylan. And he said, of course. And he gave her the collected poems of Dylan Thomas, which she bought and brought home. And so when I opened my Christmas present that Christmas morning, it was not the book I had asked for, but I would not in a million years let my mother know that and hurt her and make her sad. So I said, thank you, Mom, this is great. And I took it to my room. And I said, well, this is my Christmas present. let's give it a try. And it was like drinking a bottle of whiskey for the first time. My head blew up. It was wonderful. Hadn't the faintest idea what any of the poems was about, but I loved it. I said, I don't know what this is, but it feels good. And that's how I started reading poetry. And I wanted to find out more about poets and things like that. So that was the accident. I was saved from Bob Dylan's deathless prose by an accident that led to me beginning to write poetry. This is a poem. I had no idea that it was even going to be called Death, or that was what was it, quote unquote, about. Death calls my dog by the wrong name. A little man when I was small, death grew beside me, always taller, but always confused as I have almost never been. Confusion, like the heart, gets left behind early by a boy, abandoned the very moment futurity with her bare arms comes a waltzing down the fire escapes to take his hand. Death, I said, if your eyes were green, I would eat them. For what are days but the furnace of an eye? If I could strip a sunflower bare to its bare soul, I would rebuild it. Green inside of green, ringed round by green, there'd be nothing but new flowers anymore. Absolute Christmas. Death, I said, I know someone, a woman, who sank her teeth into the moon. For what are space and time but the inventions of sorrowing men? The soul goes faster than light. Eating the moon alive, it leaves space and time behind. The soul is forgiveness because it knows forgiveness, and the knowledge is whirligig. Whirligig taught me to live outwardly. Shoe shop, pizza parlor, surgical appliances, all left behind me with the hooey. My soul is my home, an old star hounded by old starlight. Death, I ask you, whose only story is the end of the story right from the start, how is it I remember everything that never happened and almost nothing that did? Was I ever born? I think of the suicides, all of them thriving, many of them painting beautiful pictures. I think of boys and girls murdered in their first beauty, now with children of their own. And I have a church in my mind set cruelly ablaze, and then the explosion of happy souls into the greeny, frozen Christmas Eve air. Another good Christmas, a white choir. Beside each other still, my death and I are a magical hermit. Dear mother, I miss you. Dear reader, your eyes are now green, green as they used to be before I was born.
Thank you. It feels like a good summarization of what we've discussed.
Well, this poem talks about everything I've talked about this morning. It didn't set out to do that, but that's what it did.
Yeah, we should have just read the poem. And
no, it's a poem about the Bronx. It's a poem about Rimbaud. It's a poem about poetry. And it turns out to be, like every autobiographical piece of writing, about death. But like that line, Absolute Christmas, that's Rimbaud. Noël sur la terre, as he announces in Season in Hell. And so this is my autobiography. And of course, if you're thinking about your life, you're thinking about, death has been your lifelong companion. My death is my oldest friend. We were born together.
Hence memento mori.
Every birth certificate is a death warrant, right? So we've been traveling together the whole time. And it's one of those happy poems where I got to use everything without intending to. But I guess that makes sense.
Now it's time for a game.
Okay.
I had different ideas for games today. I even had one with a doggerel poem, and I was going to reenact the Dead Parrot sketch from Monty Python.
Oh, I love that.
Where,
He's an ex-parrot.
yes, where a doggerel poem by a certain author would play the role of the dead parrot. But then I decided to go in a simpler direction, and I picked 3 excerpts from 3 different poems. One is written by you, one is written by me, and one is written by an artificial intelligence.
Oh, Christ. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm curious to see if you'd be able to identify which belongs to which.
You, me, or AI?
Yes.
Okay.
And here is the excerpts.
Okay.
And if you'd be so kind to read each of them and then suggest the aftership.
Well, I wrote number 2.
That was quick.
I didn't even need to put my glasses on for that.
At the beginning of our conversation, you said that you usually do not memorize your poetry.
No, but I've used this line in about 5 different poems.
And at that
I mean,
moment,
I do that a lot.
I really hope that you wouldn't be able to remember this one. But would you be so kind to read it?
The one I wrote? Sure. A muted contract of ascension preys upon innocence, which in its turn preys upon the idiot pilgrim at the river's edge or at the foot of a mountain. I came a long way in a loose vein of broken petals to be a stranger now. That's from my book, Beautiful Shirt.
Yes, yes. And speaking about elusiveness, is this Pound and Yeats working together?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, well, thanks a lot, because about half of my poems are Pound and Yeats working together, right? Which I guess is a form of self-congratulation. But of course, you know, Pound and Yeats worked together in that beautiful, when they lived together at Stone Cottage for a couple of years, that they were literally sharing quarters and, you know, writing together. So you could almost say that 20th century poetry in English was invented by Pound and Yeats
The cottage poets.
in Stone Cottage. But yeah.
Okay, how about 2 other picks?
Oh,
so one of them is by me, one of them is by artificial intelligence. Would you be so kind to read them and then try to identify?
Okay. Beneath the boughs of ancient sorrow, the river flows, a silent witness to the passing ages. Echoes of despair reverberate in every ripple as time weaves its intricate tapestry of loss and longing. Should I read the other one? Or
Yes,
should I
yes. Let's read both of them.
read
first.
both and then decide? The springtime tempest of my spare bewailing, confused for melancholic equinox, is like a golden scarlet weeping willow that either blossoms now or maybe fades, reformulating the Byronic hero as preponderant consumption vindicates. Well, I'd like to think that number 3 was by you, and number 1 was by the artificial intelligence.
That's right on.
Very good. Well, because number 3 is good and number 1 isn't.
I'll take that.
No, I mean, number 1 sucks. I mean, my goodness. Ancient sorrow, intricate tapestry. I mean, that could practically be a popular song, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, only you would reformulate the Byronic hero. I mean, you know you're Lermontov, so you know you're going to be doing it. That's you all over.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes. And
I did get it right.
Yes,
You're not
you
trying
did.
to cover up that I totally screwed
No,
up.
you
Okay.
did get it right.
Okay.
Yes. And the prompt for the first poem written by artificial intelligence was that it had to mimic Pound, Eliot, and Yeats to the best of its ability. That's what it came up with.
Well, that's very sad. I mean, but
So there is still hope for humanity then.
well, let's not go that far. But AI ain't going to cut it. No, I mean all this is sort of like gumbo. You know, you just whatever's in the refrigerator, you throw it in the pot and hope for the best. I mean, intricate tapestry is terrible. Ancient sorrow. What the hell is that? It's trying to sound, now that you describe it, it's trying to sound Chinese and medieval at the same time, which is, you know, I guess what a dumb shit computer would come up with.
T.S. Eliot or Gertrude Stein?
T.S. Eliot.
Keep only one. You can keep only one. Then other two should be excluded from the universe forever.
Okay.
Dante's Divine Comedy, Pound's Cantus, or Patterson by William Carlos Williams?
I can only keep one? Dante.
Dante, okay. Now, remove one. World with no wars, world with no spiritual faith, or world with no poetry? We can keep two.
I can keep two? So I can get rid of world with no spiritual faith?
You can.
Yeah, bye.
Okay, goodbye. Describe poetry in only 3 words.
Oh, 3? A recurring current event.
New York or Las Vegas?
New York.
Best 3 poets of all time, except the ones that we already discussed.
So I can't mention...
You can use Apollinaire, you can use
I can't use
Rimbaud,
Dante either?
Dante, T.S. Eliot, Pound, Yeats.
Okay, best poets of Homer,
Homer.
Shakespeare, Mallarmé.
John Gardner, although he writes about...
My old friend.
Oh, really? Nice.
I talked to him about 25 minutes before he died in a motorcycle crash. He was teaching at my old alma mater, Binghamton. Mm-hmm. And he was working on his unfinished last novel, Mickelson's Ghosts, which is about a philosophy professor at Binghamton University. I happened to be a very close friend of that professor and his entire family, and I was on the phone with them when John Gardner stopped by to say hello, because he was writing a novel where this philosophy professor was, you know, a model for the main character. And he just stopped in to say hello before he got back on his bike and went home. He lived right across the Pennsylvania border. So I said a quick hello, and then he got on his motorcycle and, as I found out later, went to his death. The next day, a friend of mine came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your friend John Gardner." I said, "What?" And they said, "Oh, he was killed yesterday." And I said, "Nonsense. I spoke, you know, just a quick hello on the phone yesterday. He can't be dead." He was. That's a hell of a book, the book he didn't finish, Mickelson's Ghosts. It's quite a thing. Mm-hmm. It's worth reading. But go ahead, you had a question.
Yeah, I took creative classes with Dr. Douglas Rice, who was John Gardner's student,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the person who inspired me to
I love Gardner's
appreciate
work.
Gardner. Yeah, and although he talks about fiction,
Mm-hmm.
he says something related to poetry.
Yeah, he loved poetry.
I want to read a quote,
Yeah.
And then I'll ask my question. Any writers, including some famous ones, write with no consciousness of the poetic effects available through prose rhythm. They put the wine on the table, put the cigarette in the ashtray, paint in the lovers, start the clock ticking, all with no thought of whether the sentences should be fast or slow, light-hearted or solemn, with wedged-in juxtaposed stresses. So if fiction benefits from poetic voice, does it apply to poetry in reverse?
No.
No.
Poetry is not a fiction. Fiction is a very different animal from poetry. And I think when we talk about poetic prose or you know, poetic passages in a work of fiction, I think we're being unkind to both genres. Mm-hmm. I think fiction has its own purposes and its own kind of sublimity, and poetry has different purposes and a different sublimity. So I think it's patronizing to both poetry and fiction to talk about poetic prose or poetic. I mean, I'm sure it's intended as a form of praise. You know, it's a very poetic passage in this Faulkner novel. But no, it's fantastic prose. It's brilliant prose. So I don't like to see the two combining. because I don't think it's true. They have very different purposes.
And that leads me to the next question. The word poetic is often utilized in very unexpected contexts. And here's an example. Poetic justice, a great phrase or an abomination?
It's an abomination. First of all, there is no such thing as justice. That's God's problem. We have nothing to do with that. And poetic is used sort of like the way the word Dutch is used as an insult when we talk about Dutch courage or a Dutch uncle or a Dutch oven. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say about the Dutch because it means literally false in every sense. And poetic justice is, of course, not justice. It's just basically irony in a rented tuxedo. I mean, I don't buy it. I don't like the way poetic is used as an adjective at all, because it is as patronizing as the way the Dutch is used in those terms.
What does it mean to be human today?
Well, I don't think there are any humans today. There are humans in training. I mean, I think the purpose of life is to become human. I don't think very many people accomplish it. Because it's an almost impossible task to be conscious of oneself as a monad, as an absolute uniqueness in the company of numberless other absolute uniquenesses. And I don't think any of us actually gets there. To be totally aware of myself as this is a one-time thing. There's only one of these in all of eternity, and all of the others are the same. It's hard to comprehend one's own eternity and the numberless eternities by which one is surrounded. Eventually, in order to whatever we call survive, we typify, we create types. Because it's just unbearable to walk into a room of people, all of whom is eternal. Only Blake could do it. When he turned to his guest and said, "I am Jesus Christ, and so are you." Which is to say, every one of us is permanent, and therefore requires complete attention, which we can't pay. It's sort of like when you try to decide what charity you should give to. Like in the present circumstances of the planet, I'm living on a fixed income, so I have to decide where my charitable donations go, and so I give them where I think they'll do the most good. Like one of my charities that I adore is Save the Children, because it's a non-political charity. It's wherever children are hungry, they send food. Wherever children are not allowed to go to school, they build a school. That's a good thing, as far as I can tell. But then I'm not giving money to X, Y, and Z. So you can't congratulate yourself for your charity because you should have given more. You didn't give everything. You kept a little for food, or you paid the rent, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's the same deal with human. None of us becomes fully human because it would require being fully aware of your own humanity and aware of everyone else's on the same scale. It would overwhelm you. I don't envy God to having to be aware of all of creation as eternal. That's a heavy load.